Thanks to AGI for hosting me today. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for being with us. And my goal is to help you to understand why and how to use story maps for research, instruction, and for other purposes. I truly want to make this worth your while today and appreciate everyone's time. Today, we're going to be focusing on story maps. And folks, just as a small note, if you do not like maps, the next 40 minutes or so is going to be a bit difficult for you to swallow. But hopefully, since you're all in the geosciences community, you see the value of maps, and maybe you think, oh, GIS, I had that in graduate school, and it was kind of difficult and challenging to get a hold of and to use and so on. And so hopefully this webinar will help you see that, yeah, GIS has evolved. And along with that, we've got something called web mapping applications, including story maps. So this presentation is actually linked to my Twitter feed, and you will be able to access all of these slides. Now, today in our webinar, we will not be able to cover every single one of these points that I have here on this slide. And the reason why is because this is on purpose. I wanted you to have additional resources that you can dig into different activities after the webinar ends. So I'm providing more than we'll be able to cover here in this short introduction. But we're going to talk about story maps. They're basically simple web mapping applications. And that's going to be important here in a minute. They're web mapping applications that combine these multimedia interactive maps with audio, video, narrative, and so on. Now, they're hosted by the organization that I serve as Education Outreach team mate in. I'm on a team that we promote GIS and spatial thinking in all levels of education: libraries, museums, universities, community colleges, K through 12 education, and so on. They're hosted by us in the cloud, but you can actually host these story maps yourself. We're going to demonstrate today how you can incorporate this builder mode. It's much like a wizard interface that you encounter in lots of different software tools these days that guide you through the development of one of these story maps. And you also are free to download and customize these story maps for even more power. Alan Carroll, Chief Cartographer at National Geographic, approached Esri about maybe 8 years ago now, saying, hey, I've got this idea for story maps. So Alan and his team came over to Esri, and they basically made a story map every week for a couple years, which, what a cool job, right? But even more importantly, once the community, academia, private industry, nonprofits, government agencies, etc., started seeing the value in these, then things really took off, as you can see here. So now there are almost 1 million story maps created, and we'll talk about how to find those story maps here in a bit. But for me, folks, one of the huge advantages is just that you don't have to be some sort of geo guru, GIS specialist, etc., to actually create this, and hopefully I'll demonstrate that today. Let's look at a couple of these as examples real quickly. We're going to, today in our webinar, make a map tour. A map tour has a gallery of small thumbnail images across the bottom, as you can see in this one, and then a larger highlighted photograph on the side, could be on the left side or the right side, as well as an interactive map. Another reason why I wanted to show this one is because it shows you that story maps are used by a wide variety of professions. In this case, the city of San Luis Obispo, as you can see, decided to use a story map to introduce the community to their police officers. Hey, this is the districts that the precincts that the police officers patrol. Here's who they are, get to know them, etc. So story map, in their view, was a great way of introducing the community to their officers. This is called a journal, a map journal. It's a more powerful kind of story map with sections, as you can see on the right side there. And unlike the map tour, which can point to basically one interactive map with many layers, a map journal can point to multiple web maps, each with many layers in them. So it's more powerful. And this one is called the series map. You can see the tabs across the top. This is exploring America's natural landscape. So there's tabs on land, geology, landforms, forest types, etc., fire potential, and much more. So that is a map series. There's also, and I know that you in the AGI community are like me, you love looking at change over time, physical and cultural changes on the landscape. And this map shows an example of that. We have a swipe series story map where it's kind of like a squeegee. You've probably seen these online. A squeegee effect where if you move the squeegee back and forth, you see different things on the left side. It could be San Francisco 1859 and San Francisco 2019, or it could be different themes on the left or right, or in the spyglass as you see there. It could be land use on one side, land cover on the other side. It could be volcanoes on one side, earthquakes on the other side, etc. So you've got a lot of power here. Hopefully you're seeing the potential here. Also, the short list, as the name implies, you get a short list of small thumbnails on one side. So picture this: if California colleges and universities aren't your cup of tea right now, you think of this as, okay, I'm going to show different landforms, eskers and lava fields and so on, instead of California colleges and universities. As you pan and zoom the map, the gallery of images on the left side changes depending on where you're zoomed and panned. So again, you've got that interactive capability. Now, story maps, as I'll mention here in a bit, is part of the ArcGIS Online platform, which means you've got the capability of using 3D scenes as well as we've done here in this story map, as you can see right here. Using a 3D scene is oftentimes the best way to show things, especially for you folks in the AGI community. I know you're all over 3D scenes of various kinds. Also, you can make a crowdsource map where you're getting input from different people either in your community or the general public, and everything in between. So you can actually set up something like that as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the Story Maps Gallery. Really briefly, the Story Maps Gallery is in this URL. You can browse by, as you can see here, a variety of different ways, and I'm just going to show the Story Maps Gallery for you right now. So here we are on storymaps.arcgis.com. I'm not logged into anything. I'm going to the gallery right here, and I'm going to see, hey, okay, I've got a variety of things that I can just browse and look at. I can also browse by the types of apps we just talked about briefly before, the short list, the map tour, etc. So if I want to see a bunch of map tours, I'll go to map tour. Okay, so I've got different examples that will hopefully inspire you to say, okay, I can do that. Based on this webinar, I've got some skills and I can go ahead and do that. You can also look at by the author or the industry. So I can look at, for example, education and research, natural resources, etc. So let me show you a couple of these story maps just to get you thinking about what you could do. Now, there is a company that we work with called White Star Legal Mapper. They decided to use a story map to show what their services are. And so they've got it listed in a tabbed format. So a little bit about their legal mapper service, and they're using a story map with an interactive map capability of showing off their services and highlighting what their company does. Here's a presentation in this live web mapping tool that I developed. It is a very simple one. You probably remember the good old topographic maps of 10 landforms. I used to work at USGS, as Layla mentioned, so I love this kind of thing. So I've got, okay, here's karst, and here's an esker, and I've got a couple of short activities. All these maps are interactive, as hopefully you're seeing on this. So here's an esker. Here is the Carrizo Plain, the offset drainages from the plate boundary, etc. So this is, and I can skip to different landforms in here to show, for example, an Oxbow Lake. So that's another presentation that is multimedia tied to the same platform. Here's one from the USGS where I used to work, and probably many of you actually work right now on this webinar. Here's one on the Mid-Continent Rift System. So it is a combination of tabs, as you can see across the top, but also they have the map journal on the left side. So it's a combination. You can actually embed a story map inside a story map. And so that's another possibility. So you've got maps, images, text, etc. This is one of my favorites from the Indiana Geological Survey. They've got a really nice Indiana limestone story map where they talk about why this limestone has been so important over the decades, really over the centuries. And one of the things I love about it as a geographer is that it tells the human story of this. What do these people do? How did they get this stone out of there 150 years ago and so on? How did that limestone get deposited? So it's a really nice, compelling story, past and present. This is actually one of my all-time favorites, the Washington Ice Age floods. So this one uses a combination of tools, but it's largely a map journal talking about the channeled scablands up in Washington State, again, with maps, images, etc. Okay? And so here is a listing at this bottom of this page. Again, I'm going to have all of these things linked, but some of the geological surveys around the different states have developed. I showed you the Indiana one, but that's not the only geological survey that has developed a compelling story map. Okay, so that is, again, off of the Story Maps gallery just by searching different resources in there. Does anybody have any questions as we move along here in the webinar? How are folks doing? Are you enjoying this?
Actually, we do have some questions, Joseph. So one question we've got is, how easy is this applied to mobile phone applications? So how does it scale between mobile phones? And I'm going to throw in there tablets as well, since a lot of people will be browsing the web on the tablet.
Absolutely. And that's one of the great things that I will mention in more detail in a bit. But since you brought it up now, when you're creating one of these story maps, you get a little tool that shows you what it's going to look like on different devices. So these are all optimized. There's no coding that you have to do to say, okay, my primary users are going to use this on an iPhone or on an Android or on a Surface Pro. It does that for you. So that's actually good. It's a slightly different experience. Again, it's optimized and there's no coding required for these other platforms, because you're exactly right. Many people look at these on different devices. Now, there's a couple of story map advantages in education, research, and beyond, and I'm not going to read all these because you've got access to these slides as well. But for those of you that are instructors, it provides you a good way of assessing student work. So let's say you have them create a story map on the research that they did on tsunamis of the Pacific, let's say, and you say, okay, this is my rubric, my grading tool for the story map that you're creating, and you tick off the requirements. They submit that. They submit the URL to you. You go in and assess it. And also, it's a great way for you to, as an instructor, get students to present with their maps, with these story maps. Not to say that I don't use Prezi or PowerPoint or other Sway. I use all those presentation tools, but I oftentimes use story maps to conduct my actual presentation. As you can see up here in this is one of my favorite topics: why GIS in education? Why is it valuable? So in this case, what I've got is a story map that indicates why I believe this is important. So again, I use other presentation tools, but oftentimes I use story maps to give a presentation. Now, a little bit of a techie series of notes here, folks. I indicated this earlier, but story maps are part of ArcGIS Online. And that's actually a good thing, because it's not just some little tool that's sort of tucked away in the corner somewhere on the web and you can't really connect to it in any other way. It's actually tied into a huge amount of analytical tools and a huge amount of content. I mean, data content. Lithology, floods, human impact, it is climate, energy, water, hydrology. It's tied to a huge variety of content that you can actually use in these story maps. So here is a web map that I used, that I created inside ArcGIS Online just for a cycling trip I took after a large geography conference. Then I decided to make a story map out of it. So same cycling trip, I wanted to see on the top here, what was the median age of the neighborhoods that I cycled through, and then I made an elevation profile, which is again part of the story mapping. You get these tools, and no coding required. I said I want the elevation profile. Thank you very much for my cycling trip. And this could be, of course, a transect that you take or a field trip that you took. So the point here is, folks, that web mapping applications are huge. They are pervasive. You see them all the time on the internet. Story maps are part of that whole body of web mapping applications. So here is another same theme. My cycling from New York City to New Jersey is a web mapping application. Now, these tabs across the top are more of a human geography theme: income, tapestry, neighborhoods, diversity, etc. But they could easily just as well have been river systems, geology, drainage, soil type, etc. Now, there are three main methods for creating these story maps. Today, we're going to use the builder tools. It's the easiest, quickest way to make a story map. By no means the only way to do it, though. Method 2 is you actually create a map first in ArcGIS Online, and when you share it, there's a prompt that says, hey, do you want to create a story map web application right now? And you can say, oh, yes, I do. Thank you very much. And then you can go to a gallery of different types, like I was showing earlier, and then you can select one of those, and then you're off and building. Method 3, we won't have time to cover it today, but just to let you know that if you want to dig deeper, and I know you AGI folks are top notch, so some of you will probably want to say, you know, those are great, those builder tools, but I want to dig deeper and I really want to customize these. So you can download from the story maps pages all of the code that goes behind the story maps, and then you can customize some of those files, and then you can even upload it to your own web server. You can upload it to your wix.com, to your, stanford.edu, to your usgs.gov, whatever website you've got access to. Let me show you an example of a story map that's embedded with this third method into somebody's web page. So here we've got Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and notice that they have a story map. Notice at the top, it's alaska.gov. And they have a story map about urban bears. Hey, we live in Alaska, we've got to deal with urban bears, what are their behaviors, etc. So I can go to this tab and I can get a pop-up, which is part of the story maps capability. And depending on the bandwidth, I'm not sure you're going to be able to see this very well, but you've got, hopefully you're seeing that, oh, you've got a webcam with bear collared webcam images on the site. So again, multimedia, and this one is embedded in the alaska.gov's page. And that's one of the reasons why I love this. Atlas for a Changing Planet, I encourage you to go and look at that sometime, time permitting. We do not have time to do that today. But things you didn't know you could do with story maps. This is another link. It shows how people are using story maps for their portfolios, for their CV. For you students out there, think about making a CV story map of all of your accomplishments. I had an internship over here. I went to grad school over here. Then I worked for this nonprofit. And then I worked for this government agency. Whatever. So it could be maps. It could be a little bit about you. That's a nice way of starting with story maps. Is make one of your resume or your CV. Tutorials and newsletters. There's all kinds of things that people are doing with these story maps. Before we actually build one, I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about, just like when you go out in the field, as I know many of you do in the AGI community. Good planning makes for good, effective field work, right? Same thing with story maps. You want to plan ahead. You don't want to just dive in and create this without thinking about your audience and how you lead people in. So just a moment about that. This isn't actually my real mom, but think about how you would explain what you do to a family member or a friend. You're not going to talk down to them. You're going to use you're not going to use a lot of jargon. Same thing with story maps, especially if you share your story maps with the world. You're going to want to be pretty specific, and you're not going to want to use some overly technical language if you're sharing it with the general public, for example. We'll talk about ways to share it in a bit, but you want to use some active descriptive titles. You want to choose the story map app. Remember those app types that I showed before, the swipe, the map tour, etc. You want to choose the map that matches your intentions. You're going to want to avoid complex symbols and icons. Remember, this is all on the web, and maybe some of the people that are looking at your story map have no idea at the beginning what your story is all about. Some of you use GIS. And so this slide is just to indicate that your story, your map for analysis is probably going to be different from your story map, right? So for you GIS analysts out there, we typically have, a pretty complex interface that we're using, and lots of different symbology and tables and tools and so on. Again, your story map is probably not going to be the same. For many months, Zoo Babies was one of our most popular story map. And the reason why I bring it up here is because think about your title. Zoo Babies sounds a lot more interesting than Young Animals at the Washington, D.C. Zoo. Okay, so your title can be really important. And just like we think about your master's thesis or a article you're working on for a journal, you're always told by your editors or your professors, yeah, okay, that's great, but make it shorter, distill it, be brief, okay? So those are just a few things that I wanted to mention. Couple last bits before we actually take one together. There is a zone called My Stories where you can manage your content in story maps. For those of you that have been webmasters over the years, this is a nice way for you to check your links and make sure your links all work to your photos, to your maps, etc. Also, I see a lot of story maps that are really compelling, but I have no idea where they are on the planet. And so think about that. Think about giving your map reader a context. Okay, I'm looking at the playa in the Great Basin in Nevada. Here's where Nevada is, et cetera. Also, you see on the webinar right now that I've got a lot of tabs open. Where are you logged in? Because when you create a story map, you're actually going to log in to ArcGIS Online. More about that in a moment, because you're going to need to create content out there. And also use folders to organize your work, be organized. Model good practice of the permitted use of imagery. Just because that photo is online doesn't mean you can use it, right? So either I use my own photographs or my own videos, or Creative Commons or US government federal agency, which is typically not copyrighted, or if I truly need to use something that someone else has produced, I ask permission. You don't want to get into a situation where you're using something from Bob's Photos Inc. and you get a call from Bob someday, right, and says, hey, I noticed you using my photo in your story map. I don't recall giving you permission to do that. You don't want to get into that situation. So model good practice of the permitted use of imagery. Also be mindful of the image size. Just because your wonderful camera, your GoPro or whatever you're using can take images at 15 megabytes, you don't need to have 100 photos in your story map all in 15 megabyte format. Remember, this is on the web, so you've got to think about people with limited bandwidth and things like that. Now, folks, you can choose to ignore my little tips here, but if you do, your story maps may become sorry maps. Oh, your story maps may become sorry maps. Oh, sorry, that was bad. I couldn't resist, though. 3 key points as we get rolling, folks, into creating one of these. This is a rapidly expanding and dynamic environment. So just keep that in mind. Keep your knees bent. Be aware that change happens on the web. It happens in mapping. And the good news is that every time the platform evolves, which is basically quarterly, you get more capabilities and you get more tools and you get more functionality. So think about that. And lastly, as I mentioned before, good planning makes for a good story map. Let's go ahead and build a map tour. What's a map tour, Joseph? Well, remember that San Luis Obispo police map? That is the very top one that I'm showing in this slide right here. You'll see that we'll get a gallery of images across the bottom and a larger one on the left side and an interactive map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through these procedures right now. I'm going to go to storymaps.arcgis.com. And again, this is on the slides here, but let's just go ahead and do that. So storymaps.arcgis.com. And what we did earlier, a couple minutes ago, we looked at the gallery. Remember the gallery where you can go and find story maps of various kinds for inspiration. You can also teach with the content in that gallery or show your colleagues. But right now I'm going to go to the Apps tab at the top, and I'm going to say, I want to create a story. And so let's create a story. If you didn't know what kind of app to choose, you can hover over these as I'm doing here, and it guides you a little bit. If you want more, there's no shortage of tutorials on this stuff, folks. There's lots of good documentation on how to create these, and I'll talk about at the end where to go from here. We have a GeoNet zone. Also, it's a conversation that happens online where there are posts daily from people wanting to get information, people sharing information, etc. I'm going to go ahead and build a map tour right now. And so the first thing it's going to say is, okay, are you logged into ArcGIS Online? Now, if you are not logged into ArcGIS Online, you need to get a login to ArcGIS Online. You need to get a sign in. Now, many of you are at federal agencies, state, local government. Chances are you probably already have a subscription to this. If you do not, if you're at a university, you probably have a subscription to this. If you're in a K-12 school, you probably have a subscription to this. If you truly do not have a subscription, though, you can go to developer.arcgis.com and sign up for a free account. developer.arcgis.com. Then you'll be all ready to roll, and you'll get a free login to the ArcGIS Online, which is the platform that story maps are built on. So the first thing it asks you is, okay, where are your images or videos? Well, in this case, I've got them on Flickr, and I'm going to type in my username, and I'm going to look up some of the images that I've got on Flickr. Now, Flickr is not the only place you can store these photos. You can, as you can see on the right-hand side here, you can actually store your photos or your imagery inside ArcGIS Online if you choose. I'm going to go to, how about Trees of Australia? Good on you, mate. Trees of Australia. Let's go ahead and do that. import, just as an example. Okay, so it knows where my photos are because they're geotagged. Now, if your photos are not in their correct spot for whatever reason, either you're downtown in a city center where you've got lots of tall buildings, or you're in a canyon somewhere, or you're inside a building, or for whatever other reason where you don't have good Wi-Fi triangulation, cell phone tower triangulation, and or GPS triangulation, for whatever reason, you do not have good signal from any one of those three sources, you can drag the position of your photo at this point to the correct spot. In my case, they're all geolocated. I'm happy with those locations. And now I can go ahead and say import. And now I've got my trees of Australia, 5 photos at different points. So this was part of my goal of showing different tree species. Look at this one, folks. It is fascinating. If I don't like the order of that, I can go to the left side here and say, you know what, that Banksia tree in Sydney, I'm going to drag that to the first position. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And now the Banksia tree is the first one. What else might I want to do with this? What if I want to change this so that maybe the base map is imagery with labels? Oh, I can do that. I can change the extent. I can zoom in to exactly where I took this photograph in this case. What if I want additional layers on this map, like in my case, since it's a vegetation map showing different tree species, maybe I want a map of mean annual rainfall or the ecoregions of Australia. You see where I'm going with this, right, folks? So let's say I call this Trees of Australia, and I'm going to call it the AGI webinar. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and save that. And this is going to bounce me to the position where I indicated earlier, hey, you've got a thing called My Stories. So if I go to My Stories now, it's going to show me all of the story maps that I've created in this login in ArcGIS Online. So here's my Trees of Australia, and you will have the same thing. You will be able to then go to this zone and say, you know, I want a better thumbnail, or I want more metadata, or I want to check and make sure all the trees work in my images, or I want to change the base map. This is where I was indicating I could add different layers to my base map. Another thing to point out about this My Story zone is notice on the left side here where it's the sharing. Right now, nobody can see it except me. Well, you can share it because we're on the webinar, right, folks? But nobody else can see it. If I wanted to share it just with my organization, that'll be people in your organization. What do I mean by organization? Well, your university or your federal agency or your nonprofit or wherever your subscription for ArcGIS Online is housed, you will be able to share it with just those people in that organization. You can also get a little bit more granular. You can make a group inside that organization. Maybe it's 5 researchers, maybe it's 10 researchers all working on, I don't know, volcanoes of the Aleutians, and you just want to share it with them. You can do that. Or on the right side here, you can share it with the public. But even if you share it with the public, you have to do something to let people know where it is. You have to blog about it. You have to tweet about it. You have to send an email to people, because as you may have noticed, when I was at some of these story maps before, notice this big, long, gnarly alphanumeric string. And because of that, every one of these story maps has a map ID. And this map ID is unique to that map, as the name implies. So you need to tell people where it is. It's not going to come up in some random Google search, is what I'm getting at. So that is the My Stories zone. Does anybody have any questions about that? Here's what we did just now. We went through this slide and we basically made a story map. Sure, I can change it. I can create different, I can add images to it. I can change one of the images to a video. I can change the base map, add content to the map. But basically, as it was, we created in about 30 seconds or so the beginnings of a story map, as you can see there. All right. So in the slides, I have you go a little bit deeper into that. Okay. So activity number 2. I also have an additional activity in there as well, so you can dig deeper this evening or over the next week. You and I have been on lots of technical webinars in the past, folks, and I can identify with, maybe this is all new to you, and you can say, okay, I get it. but I need to practice, and that's exactly it. I highly encourage you sometime over the next few days, over maybe the next week, go through and create one of these. Because we've all been to sessions in the past where, months now goes by and life happens and work happens. And now, what did we do with Joseph way back in March? I can't remember. So just, again, encourage you to tap into this soon. Okay, we've got about 9 minutes left in my segment here. So I'm going to go into making a story map journal now, okay? I'm going to go ahead and skip down a little bit and make a story map journal. This is more powerful. So right now I'm going to go to storymaps.arcgis.com, and guess what? It's the same place we went to before. We're going to go to apps. Now the journal is more powerful than a map tour, and that's why we're going to use it. So now I'm going to go to map journal, and I'm going to go back to my slide. I'm going to say build, and I'm going to choose a layout, and I'm going to pick a side panel. Okay, so I'm going through side panel, start, great. And coming back to my instructions, I'm going to say, my title is going to be Feeding the Planet. So this is going to be about sustainable agriculture. Okay, so here, this is right here, Feeding the Planet. You can see that this is the builder mode, so it's going to guide you through these steps along with my slides. So now you get 2 panels. You get a main stage and a side panel. Now it's asking, okay, what do you want in the main stage? I'm going to configure content, and I'm going to put an image in there. So I'm going to click on image, and I'm going to go to Flickr again, and I'm going to go to a different account this time, Story Maps. I'm going to load those albums. Great. Now, one of the things that you can see in here, I've got a lot of different kinds of content in there, and I'm going to go to Workshop 10. Okay, this is where I've got the agriculture images stored. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this ground nuts under cultivation, and that's great. And I can put some alt text in there for accessibility, but I'm going to skip through these. I'm not going to spend time putting text in. I figured, to make your time worthwhile. But look, I've got section 1 here. Now I'm going to add a section, and this is where it really gets interesting, because instead of an image now, we're going to go to a map. Let's go to our instructions, and now I'm on the map part. I'm going to add a section. I'm going to call it current crop yields, and then I'm going to select a map. I'm going to go to Story Maps Workshop Feeding, in this case, for my map. And so here I've got feeding. I'm going to go to sustainable agriculture, okay, and my map. Select a map. This is where the whole power of ArcGIS Online comes in, because you've got access to tons of content that either you've created or your colleagues have created. And I'm going to type in Story Map Workshop Feeding so I can see mine. These are all publicly shared. I'm going to click on this one, and this is where, folks, this kind of gives me the geo-tingles, if you know what I mean. This is powerful stuff here. I'm going to configure this map with my own custom. Look, I can say I only want major lakes. I don't want the country boundaries. I want current crop yields notes and the current crop yields. I don't want the elevation hill. Yeah, I guess I do want the elevation hill shade. I'm going to save that map content, and now I'm going to go to next. And now you can see, let me scoot these windows aside. Now, look, I've got 2 sections in my story map. The first one with an image, and the second one has my interactive web map. So hopefully that'll give you a sense of, okay, yeah, these journals are powerful, but look, I can add sections and add multimedia, web maps, narrative, audio, video, you name it. And so you're not coding anything, but if you know a little bit of HTML, that'll certainly help at certain points, especially if you want to customize. Speaking of customization, if you know a little bit of JavaScript, that'll help too. But the bulk of these story maps, no coding required. Folks, it's a beautiful world. It truly is. So now I've gone through and created a story map that is a map journal type of story map. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the Elwha River story map. Now, again, we've just started down the pathway of making a map journal. This is another kind called a map, a cascade. a map cascade. And this gives you a sort of an immersive feel. You can see you can loop a video, depending on the bandwidth. I'm not sure how well this is coming through, but we've got a little looping video. And this is all about the pros and cons of removing a dam and what happened in Washington State when the dam was removed, and all about the habitat, all about the legal issues that were encompassed here. And as you can see here, we've got a 3D scene in this particular story map because it's all about watersheds and rivers, so a 3D scene made total sense. Okay, and it's all about, again, the Native Americans and how they cultivated here and how they used the land for centuries. All kinds of interesting things that are in this story map. Now I'm going to skip down to the end because I want to just give you a little preview of coming attractions. If you go through these slides, you'll be able to make a tabbed map. You're going to be able to make a side accordion map. In this particular one, I'm going to have you upload some text as a table, and you're going to create a story map from a table of data. Maybe you've got a table of data and it's lat longs of soil samples or water quality samples along a stream or geologic sites that you've visited, etc. So I'm going to have you do that. And then ever so briefly, I'm going to have you look at, in these slides, the method 3, configurable apps, and you'll see an example of one that I made. Okay, well, we've done a lot here. Quiz time. Story map journals can access only one map, true or false. Now, we don't have polling on this particular webinar, but I'll just give you as you think about it, I'll give you the answer. Story map journals can access more than one map. It's the map tour that can only access one map. Now, that map can have more than one layer in it, but a map tour can only access one map. A journal, though, as we were building with that Feeding the Planet example, can access multiple web maps. Number 2, once you create a story map, you can delete the ArcGIS Online map behind it. A little bit of a tricky way I've worded that question, but you can technically remove it, but you should not remove it because the story map, remember, points to your ArcGIS Online map, and that map has to be there. Now, the builder mode creates that map behind the scenes. You don't actually have to go to ArcGIS Online and construct the map. The builder mode takes care of all that for you. But the map has to be there, and you don't need to do anything with it, but you can customize it and add things to it. Okay, couple of final examples. You might want to look at communicating the language of science using story maps. So this is our chief scientist, Dr. Dawn Wright. Every year she updates this. It's her science story. It's her way of explaining what she does and why she does it with a story map, along with other examples of other people using story maps. How do I continue with this? This sounds great, but I want to keep moving forward. Well, there is a story maps blog out on this site here. There's also our education blog. Our team writes about all kinds of education-related geospatial technology, including story maps. So we're a firm believer in this for teaching, learning, and research. There is a story maps newsletter. There is a MOOC, a massive open online course called Do It Yourself Geo Apps. We offer that several times a year, along with our other free ESRI MOOCs, one on cartography, one on spatial analysis, and others. This one, the Geo Apps, as the name implies, includes story maps. And some of you may wonder, hey, Joseph, you used Flickr for your photo archive. How do I use other photo archives for my own story maps? Where should I put my photos, and how do I manage all that content? So I've got a document upon popular demand that people were asking me to curate and maintain. Okay, so folks, that I know was a truckload of geo information, but I hope it was useful, and I hope you're starting to think, gosh, I can do this. And I want to start with just encouraging you to start small. Don't, look at some of these story maps like the Elwha River. Sure, that took multiple days. It may have even taken someone several weeks to create. Starts with something small, like I did in the example that we ran through together. Thanks for being here, folks.